Today on Arts 24, one of the most popular and critically acclaimed authors of her generation. More than 20 years after bursting onto the literary scene with her debut novel White Teeth, Zadie Smith's sixth book, The Fraud, is out in French, based on real events in Victorian England. Zadie Smith, hello, I'm so happy to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Before we get into the book, I wanted to ask you about Paris. You've said New York is your favourite city. You recently moved back to London after living in New York for a while. I wondered, what does Paris mean to you?
It's when my parents came here on honeymoon, but it was a problem because they were black and white. It was 1975. And then I came here with my brother in the 90s, and it was a problem again, trying to get into a club. So I didn't really have a relationship with Paris. And then I started working for NYU and coming here every summer. And then I fell in love. I always thought Italy was my country because I speak Italian and I lived in Rome. I had that English parochial feeling about Paris, like part jealousy, part fear. But now I absolutely love it. And part of the reason for moving back to America was to be near Europe.
Well, Hemingway and Fitzgerald spent a lot of time here in Paris. I've seen actually you sometimes compare to them because they had this status of being literary stars. I wondered what you think of that status today, nearly 25 years since your first book, White Teeth.
Hemingway shot himself in the face and Fitzgerald drank himself to death. So I'm trying to avoid whatever that is. I'm almost 50. It seems very distant to me. And, there's lots of new debut novelists who can take that mantle. I would just say, I said to myself, and I would say to them, do your work. There's not much point in being a so-called celebrity writer if you can't write.
You completed your first novel while you were at university, and White Teeth was published in 2000. You were only 24. Do you remember sort of the period before that and the period after when things changed for you?
I absolutely remember going to a cash machine on the Kilburn High Road and taking out £10 instead of £5, and then realising I might even take out £100 and nothing desperate was going to happen. So for me, it was an absolute existential difference, overnight, it's a weird thing to happen to a person. I was able to pay my mother's mortgage. It's the first time anyone in our family ever owned something outright. This is a massive difference. But to me, it was a bit more seamless in that I'd been in college and then I wrote a book, and then my actual practical experience of life involves sitting in a room in front of the Microsoft Word program for the past 25 years.
And you were first published at the start of the century, the start of a new millennium. At the time you said it felt like it was going to be the beginning of something new for working class black British writers. Do you think it was?
It's undeniable that the landscape has transformed. Like, I'm no longer the only black person in a literary room, not by a long shot. But a lot of that, when you actually look at it, is West African writers, West African upper middle class writers. It might look to, I think, white people in the literary world that there's a big change, but when I look at it, I see what was always there. That's not the same as people I come from, who remain for the most part poor and in bad schools. So that change has not been as large as I would like it to have been. There are incredible people like Candace Carty-Williams, there's Caleb Nelson as well, but a lot of them are upper middle class people and/or Africans, yeah.
Well, you were in Paris because your sixth book, The Fraud, is being released in French. Why did you resist the historical novel for so long, and what changed?
It's not that I resist it, it's just that I had to do it my own way. Like, I think just on principle, I don't like to do something that's already been done. Sometimes I write where I keep quiet for a long time, like sometimes 5, 6, 7 years, and I just listen to what people are saying about something. And it was the same with the 19th century. I sat in my classrooms in New York and with friends and just in the general culture listening to this version of the 19th century. Because two stories were being told simultaneously. One was that was a backward and repressed time, and we are like the perfected example of those backward people. And in the same breath, people will say, but this is the worst time that's ever existed. So I was just curious, how can it be both? How can we be living in the end of days and also be a great improvement on these terrible, repressed, ignorant people of the 19th century?
Well, lots of things weren't actually that different by the sounds of it. The background of the book is a trial where we hear about a populist hero whipping up support with conspiracy theories and fake news. There are debates about race.
Yeah.
And the responsibility of the privileged. How much were contemporary politics on your mind while you were writing this?
politics were on my mind, and the relation of power, just how powerful people with money behave towards the poor. And that doesn't change that much, for sure, but there are reasons for optimism. Like, I'm telling a story about 400 years of racialized capital in the form of slavery, but I'm also telling a story about 400 years of opposition to exactly that situation, from working people of Birmingham, Manchester, London, middle-class women boycotting sugar, actual anti-slavery activists, the slaves themselves rebelling every few years, mass petitions. You know, it's both a story of horror and a story of mass action.
And the book is mostly set in London. There is a part that is set in Jamaica where we hear about one slave's experiences. You grew up in London with a Jamaican mum and a white British father. This is the first time you've written head-on about slavery.
Everything I write is about the diaspora, the fact of it. It's just an extraordinary historical rupture, an enormous continent which might have developed in, well, who knows, a myriad of different ways. Its timeline was disrupted. So I've always been interested in it, obviously from a personal point of view, because that history is why I exist, but just because it's so central to the formation of the modern world.
And there's a host of real historical characters in the book. The central character is called Eliza Touché. She thinks very freely. She's quite unconventional. Why and how did she become the main voice in the book?
Because when I was researching it, she's the person who there's the least paper trail about. You know, when you have a dinner in London, just like email, people would send many, many letters in a day because the post was so incredibly efficient. Quite often when they're organising this dinner, Thackeray will ask Dickens, or Dickens will ask Wilkie Collins, is Mrs. Touché going to be there? I was like, why are they so concerned about whether this housekeeper is going to be at the table? And it's a sense of anxiety, like, is she going to be there? Do I have to sit next to her? Oh, you know how she is. And I'm like, well, how was she? This is fascinating. Why was she someone a bit prickly that you wanted to avoid, grown men were scared of at a dinner party? So that was kind of the spark of it. I was just fascinated thinking about this woman who was significant enough for Dickens to sign a book for and spend a lot of time with. He spent a lot of time with her.
And you write at one point in the book, the humiliations of girlhood, the separating of the beautiful from the plain and the ugly, the terror of maidenhood, the trials of marriage or childbirth or their absence, the loss of that same beauty around which the whole system appears to revolve, the change of life, what strange lives women lead. Not much has changed since then, has it?
That part's pretty consistent. But again, to be too cynical about a lack of change is really dangerous because it's apolitical. The fact is, if I look at Eliza's life compared to mine, I have, for the most part, my full civil rights. I own my own property. It belongs to me. My children are mine and cannot be taken from me without reason by their father or the state. These are enormous differences, in fact. I can work, I can demand, it is enshrined in law, whether it happens, it doesn't always happen, that I will be paid equal to my male counterparts. These are not, to say, as some people often do, oh, nothing changes, is to really dismiss and pour scorn on 200 years of feminist activism, which has created quite a monumental amount of change, actually. So when I'm writing, I'm trying to keep that balance of knowing that, of course, there are problems that are eternal. The menopause isn't going anywhere, but things do change, conditions around it change.
You've said you've always been fascinated by the sex life of the English. Eliza has a complicated and romantic life, as many of the characters do. Can you tell me more about that?
I think we have a strange reputation, I mean, compared to the French, obviously, or the Swedish, or all these supposedly sex-positive nations. I think most Europeans would agree that the English are the strangest. Isn't that fair? It's the strangest sexual life because it's so masked, but it's no less active, is my point. I think that was what was amusing me talking sometimes to students, is they had this very odd idea that sex was their own invention. Of course, as you think about it, looking back to my youth and then the boomers before me, I think that's a perennial delusion of young people. You always think, oh, wow, I've discovered this incredible thing and I'm doing it in a completely different way. And of course, it's impossible that in 10,000 years of human civilization, people who haven't had sex in every possible way, it's possible to have sex. So it's not a question of reinventing the wheel, but it's a question of how do people think about the sex they're having, and that is interesting. And the more you read about the Victorians, it just becomes clear that their marriages are extremely complicated. You know, they're filled with many people. And you can, in literary history, you can start to glimpse it at Bloomsbury. Bloomsbury is when all that's been unspoken kind of puts its head above the parapet. Like Virginia Woolf's sister marries a man, they have a child, that man had an affair with another man who ends up marrying that child. If you want to talk about complicated sexual family relations, I mean, that would shock, I think, the most ardent polyamorous Gen Z person. So that's what I mean. Like, it's important not to have these kind of false ideas about the people of the past and imagine yourself radically new.
Do you have any idea what your next book might be, or are you still listening and watching and thinking?
And it's actually, it's slightly French, but I'm kind of just thinking about it. Yes, I'm in that period of sitting around thinking.
When you lived in New York, you were teaching, and you said that The Bluest Eyes by Toni Morrison is your favourite book to teach. Tell us why.
Everybody who teaches literature enjoys a short book, that's number one. But it's so unusual because it really is a work of genius. Students all come to class with this almost worshipful attitude towards Toni Morrison without ever having read her. So that's always an amusing combination. So then you give them her first book, her most famous book perhaps, Until Beloved. And I think what happens is shock, because it's quite experimental, it's extremely provoking, and it runs counter to a lot of common sense ideas about literature that are in the present atmosphere. So it includes a sympathetic paedophile, for example, is in the center of The Bluest Eye. There are many characters who are really challenging to a contemporary reader. So I enjoy teaching it because it's surprising.
And you have lived abroad for, is it over 17 years? 17
yeah,
years?
a long time.
You came back to London during the pandemic. I wondered why and how was it going?
I just ran away from the pandemic. My husband's father died of COVID not long after we got back, so it was right to get back because people we knew were dying. So we went home, and then it's a useful experience. I'm trying to make it a useful political experience because I have come back to a country that is almost unrecognizable to me. And so that's good. So I get to be like the ancient mariner and to walk around saying things like, do you know there used to be a decent healthcare in this country? And do you know you used to be able to go to university for free? And so I feel like it's important to repeat these matters, to shame this government, and to encourage young people to believe that those things are not impossible goals.
Well, on that note.
Thank you.
Zadie Smith, thank you very much.
Thank you.